What happens when you cross the genius of Adam Smith with the insights of Charles Darwin? Well, you get someone like Andrew Lau. A professor at MIT's Sloan School of Management, Andrew has a unique approach to finance, blending statistical analysis, neuroscience, and everything in between to crack the code of the markets. But a few years back, life threw him a curveball. He was tasked with the biggest research problem of his life. You see, his mother, a brave Chinese immigrant who had left a difficult husband and single-handedly raised Andrew and his siblings in New York City, was diagnosed with lung cancer. Determined to understand her prognosis and ensure she got the best care, Andrew dove headfirst into research mode. A colleague at the university introduced him to the chief scientific officer of a biotech firm in Cambridge, one that was developing an experimental drug for exactly the type of cancer his mother had. The chief scientific officer and the chief financial officer, who had studied Andrew's work in grad school, agreed to meet with the professor to discuss their treatment's trajectory and whether they might help his mom. During that conversation, Lowe told Rana Furuhar, the author of Makers and Takers, The Rise of Finance and the Fall of American Business, I asked what I thought was an innocent question. What influence does your source of financing have, if any, on your scientific agenda? The two executives looked at each other and laughed ruefully. Then the CSO turned back to him and gave an answer that left him speechless. Influence? Finance drives our research agenda. As the son of a patient depending on the company's treatment to save her life, Andrew found that answer outrageous. He wondered, what do stock market volatility, interest rates, and Fed policy have to do with whether you can cure cancer by angiogenesis or immunotherapy? So, why are companies putting people's lives above profit-making schemes? Why are the people in charge not doing the right thing? Why are scientists and academics accepting payouts from big pharmaceutical companies? This is why business managers are failing Americans and the world.
The unemployment rate right now has jumped to 14.7%.
Those numbers are just absolutely brutal.
Meanwhile, McDonald's has joined other big firms in layoffs.
Details this morning in a story we've been following. U.S. Auto Sales is officially shutting down operations for good.
Business owners struggling to find enough staff despite millions of Americans still unemployed.
Chapter 1. How profit-making took over business education. Business wasn't always taught the way it is today. For a long time, it wasn't taught at all. Corporate leadership were populated not by trained professionals, but by people who operated primarily on instinct. At the turn of the century, a mere 1/5 of these leaders held college degrees, let alone the now coveted MBA. Business education, as we know it today, has humble roots. The Wharton School, a pioneer in this field in the late 19th century, primarily offered vocational classes aimed at fostering local business ecosystems. This was a common thread that wove together many of the early institutions, like the Eastman schools and Folsom's Commercial College. However, the shadow of the Great Depression cast a long and transformative shadow over the role of business in society. In the wake of the 1929 market crash, capitalism found itself under scrutiny, with many pointing towards it as a failed system. This led industry titans to retreat into their commercial fortresses, seeking new justifications for their existence and strategies to counter the perceived political threat from the Soviet Union. This created strong resistance to more expansive labor relationships, akin to those seen in Germany, where the state, businesses, and workers maintained a collaborative approach. This resistance further cemented the focus on number crunching and cash management. Nevertheless, by the 1950s, American business schools had embraced a data-centric approach, teaching operations and systems research. This methodology, popularized by Rand, was eagerly adopted by policymakers and executives like Robert McNamara. All of it was facilitated by the rise of more mathematically focused economics bolstered by the capabilities of giant new computers. These mammoth machines crunched extensive data sets, providing reams of information for business educators to formulate strategies. While these strategies were not guaranteed to work flawlessly in the real world, they presented a compelling narrative to the public. At the time, convincing the masses of the efficacy of American-style capitalism was a matter of pressing concern, particularly for conservative elites alarmed by the looming influence of communism. Harvard Business School Dean Donald K. David underscored this urgency in a 1948 speech to a group of influential business executives. He said, "We face a long continuing struggle throughout the world for men's minds, and indeed for men's souls. The best way to preserve our system is to make it work." His conviction that business leaders could rise to this challenge was a beacon of hope amidst the tension of the times. In response, America's capitalists and philanthropists marshaled their resources to reshape business education to support this cause. Foundations such as Ford and Carnegie, and others like the Walgreen Foundation, established by the fervently anti-communist drugstore magnate Charles Walgreen, began investing in an approach to business education that would make it seem more serious and weighty, and present it as a real science to be reckoned with. As a result, business and economics began to evolve, and framed itself as a hard sciences. One of the pivotal moments for this new school of thought was the publication in 1947 of economist Paul Samuelson's Foundations of Economic Analysis, which made a case for a new approach to economic thinking, one that resembled the abstract, hyper-rational field of physics much more than the messy reality of the social sciences. The public rhetoric of that era made it apparent that the elite were somewhat uncomfortable associating business education with the gritty realities of the factory floor. A 1952 issue of Business Week heralded the impending rise of a new paradigm, stating, "The day of the truly professional general management man isn't here yet, but it's not far away. That man will be trained for management in general, rather than in any one phase of business. He'll learn his technique in school, rather than on the job." Some experts were concerned that business schools were producing a bunch of capitalist sheep. The management guru Peter Drucker, in particular, worried that business schools no longer see themselves as social instruments. They want to be respectable, as, say, mathematics departments are respectable. But this is wrong. Professional schools are not intellectual institutions, but social institutions. Old-timers at the business schools had one great strength. They knew what they were talking about. Given their underdog complex about either the liberal arts or the hard sciences, business schools increasingly began employing PhDs who specialized in neoclassical economics, a field that was gaining prestige thanks to the increased focus on mathematical modeling and data analysis. In fact, this trend is still largely prevalent today. Never mind that these models bear little resemblance to real-world business scenarios and were always theoretical. The belief was that such modeling made economics and business educators more like their peers in the math or physics departments, and elevated the status. The epicenter of all this free market mathematical model-oriented thinking was the University of Chicago. It was, after all, the home of Milton Friedman, the economist known perhaps more than any other for championing the markets know best argument. Educated at Chicago and Columbia, Friedman gained exposure to the McNamara-style systems analysis via a stint at the U.S. Navy-sponsored Statistical Research Group, which operated at Columbia during the war. Two other young economists he worked with there, George Stigler and W. Allen Wallace, also went on to become professors at Chicago. They jointly developed what came to be known as the Chicago School of Economics. Its anti-government, anti-regulation, and fanatically pro-market ideology has continued to dominate American economics and business education ever since. With the backing of substantial business foundations like Ford, the University of Chicago attracted some of the most eminent names in economics. The Walgreen Foundation, a longtime supporter of the university, began directing its financial grants towards the business program. The University of Chicago thus became the nucleus of a robust push for deregulation and support for large corporations. Laissez-faire theories, backed by volumes of data generated by state-of-the-art computers on campus, courtesy of its Defense Department ties, were the order of the day. This led to a finance-centric approach to business education, where the primary focus shifted from companies to markets. A recent account describes this new way of thinking as free market-oriented and interested only in the predictive power of theory, irrespective of the realism of assumptions. While this new approach may have been more theoretical than practical, it was rapidly adopted and became the trend for anyone aspiring to a career in corporate America or the finance industry. Theoretical or not, the impact of this shift on the landscape of American business education was, and continues to be, monumental. Chapter 2. The Morality of Business Education. An increasing number of business educators at top schools are concerned not only that MBA programs are churning out number crunchers without a conscience, but that the programs themselves no longer uphold the mission of America's leading universities, which has always been to preserve, create, and transmit knowledge to advance the public good. That's precisely the concern voices by Harvard Business School professor Rakesh Khurana, whose book From Higher Aims to Hired Hands tracks the evolution of business education in America over the last century. Khurana makes a powerful case that the paradigm of business education must become more inclusive, broad-based, and socio-politically responsible if America is to avoid Thomas Piketty's predictions of growing inequality, political dysfunction, and social instability. One of the most corrosive effects of Chicago schools' thinking and teaching on American business education is that it detached the latter from its roots in morality and social responsibility, the very Calvinist foundations on which it was built in the late 19th century. The whiz kids' Cold War era approach to management may have been too ideological. Still, agency theory and common assumptions about the ingrained efficiency of markets left business leaders with no moral basis on which to operate at all. The theories espoused a selfish view of the world, in which everyone was out to get what they could get, and nobody could be trusted. In this world, which was first and foremost about profit-making for a small group of people, everything was and should be transactional. It's perhaps no wonder then that MBA students and American managers evolved to take this cool and calculating perspective on things. As Harold Leavitt, the late Stanford management psychologist, once put it, the new professional MBA-type manager has started to look more and more like the professional mercenary soldier, ready and willing to fight any war, and to do so coolly and systematically, but without ever asking the tough pathfinding questions. Is this war worth fighting? Is it the right war? Is the cause just? Do I believe in it? Before the financial crisis, business schools did very little to address public concerns about things like inequality, the growing number of corporate scandals, or executive malfeasance. Had stuff like the insider trading revelations of the 1980s, the accounting debacles of the 1990s, or the subprime crisis been happening in other industries, it would undoubtedly have provoked more soul-searching. While there was hope after the 2008 meltdown that business schools might lead the charge toward a new and more sustainable kind of capitalism, academic leaders in the field have been largely silent. Their efforts mainly focused on more marginal issues, like promoting more corporate social responsibility or diversity within boardrooms. Curricula that deal with the morality and structure of finance or question the current system of capitalism are growing in popularity, but are still few and far between. Harvard Business School Dean Nitin Noria admits that most Harvard business students are still drawn to finance, although more of them now go into venture capital and private equity than investment banking, which is not surprising given that's where big money now is. The percentage of students starting new businesses upon graduation has shot up, but at 9%, it's still less than a third of the share that goes into finance. Change isn't happening fast enough, and this is partly because the intellectually limited and increasingly commercial nature of business education has resulted in a situation where academics are, as Khurana puts it, hampered by their lack of a frame of reference within which even to consider the questions now being asked about them. The ecosystem of business education is sick. Yet there's a total sense of powerlessness about changing any of this, even amongst the most powerful people in the world, he notes. The MBA degree has morphed from a valuable educational resource into an exclusive club and passport to wealth for a select few. This inherent selfishness threatens not just how business is run, argues Khurana, but the academic degree itself, which many argue has become an overpriced commodity. Chapter 3. Research for Hire. Indeed, academics have become products that can be bought and sold to the highest bidder. Much of the funding for academic research at top-tier economics departments and business schools comes from the financial industry and people and institutions close to it. In 2011, Gerald Epstein, a professor at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and his colleague Jessica Carrick-Hagenbarth published a paper on conflict of interest issues in academia after the financial crisis. They looked at the media writings, public appearances, and published research of 19 academics, financial economists who belonged to influential groups that advanced recommendations on financial regulation and reform. The authors then analyzed how these economists described their affiliations with their public academic institutions and, in many cases, private financial firms. The paper concluded that most of the time, the economists did not reveal possible conflicts of interest or private industry affiliations when they should have. One of the more shocking examples of such conflicts of interest was unveiled in the Oscar-winning 2010 documentary Inside Job, which examined the policy decisions that led to the financial crisis. Filmmakers profiled Columbia University economist and business school dean Glenn Hubbard, formerly the chief economic advisor to the George W. Bush administration, interviewing him about his role in financial deregulation, as well as various private sector associations that may have encouraged him to take a more finance-friendly view to policy issues. These associations included, among others, working as a $1,200 an hour consultant for Countrywide Financial, a mortgage lender that was deeply involved in the subprime crisis and had to be bailed out by the federal government, and getting paid $100,000 to testify in defense of Ralph Cioffi and Matthew Tannen, two Bear Stearns hedge fund managers who were prosecuted and later acquitted for fraud. Hubbard had also co-authored a Goldman Sachs report in 2004 entitled How Capital Markets Enhance Economic Performance and Facilitate Job Creation, in which he said that credit derivatives were protecting banks from losses by redistributing risk. He, however, did not disclose how much he was paid to write the report. The episode eventually led Columbia and several other institutions to tighten their policies around academic conflicts of interest. Schools themselves have become mere products in the marketplace. Academics no longer do research driven solely by passion or an innate curiosity about the world's most pressing questions. They now take into account what will sell to students and the people who will ultimately hire them, who are in many ways the end consumers. Schools aggressively market themselves as brands to these prospective shareholders, with full-page advertisements in the Wall Street Journal and Financial Times showcasing their value proposition. There is scant mention of a mission or the kind of education students might receive from such programs, but there's plenty of market signaling about how students can rapidly amass wealth if they choose one school over another. The primary focus is no longer about imparting knowledge and skills, but about selling an idea of success and wealth. Chapter 4: Human Capital Over Cash. It's ironic that even as business schools continue to teach their students linear, traditional, finance and math-oriented thinking, American businesses are in urgent need of leaders who understand not just balance sheets, but also people. Business schools are still teaching that you should run your company the way people did decades ago. Marshal your capital and treat labor like an expendable cost, says Mark Bertolini, the CEO of the health insurance giant Aetna. But the world has completely changed. We're awash in capital. There's a shortage of skilled labor out there. So business schools are still using the same old teaching models, even though we're now in a world that's so complex it can't be modeled, Bertolini offers. Indeed, in early 2015, Bertolini did something that no business school management course would have recommended. He voluntarily raised the minimum wage in his firm to $16 an hour. Not only was it more than double the federal minimum wage amount, but it was also $1 more than the most generous proposals being paraded by congressional liberals at the time. The decision resulted from a forensic data dive within his own company. Bertolini had started an internal blog by which he communicated with employees and quickly began receiving many complaints from workers about how they found it challenging to live and work on the wages and benefits they were receiving. Bertolini asked managers for more information about these workers, the majority of whom were on the front lines of customer service in call centers, and discovered to his surprise that primary economic data about the workforce was either not being collected or not readily accessible. It turned out that despite all the spreadsheets used to calculate costs and profits, little was known about the people who constituted Aetna's business. A year-long journey of data collection thus ensued. Bertolini discovered that of the 7,000 people interacting with customers daily, 81% were women, most were single moms, and many had children on Medicaid benefits. That's when he began to agitate for higher wages. Despite pushback from his board, he succeeded. There's a creeping dumbness in being a CEO, says Bertolini. You have to get behind the numbers, the spreadsheets, and the sort of thing you're taught to look at in business school. You have to understand problems in human terms. For Bertolini, raising wages was just good business, even though it contradicted conventional economic and business wisdom. He understood that the health industry, along with almost every other business, would be using more complex technology in the future and would need to transition to a more direct-to-consumer model. This transition would necessitate higher-level skills and superior thinking from employees, even those at entry-level positions. With the growing competition for the best workers, Bertolini wanted to prepare with competitive wages and a clear upward path for his employees. His company had plenty of cash on hand, but what he couldn't find as easily were the types of employees who could help his business succeed in an increasingly complex world. The day it all went public in the Wall Street Journal, says Bertolini, we began getting lots of calls from other CEOs asking how we'd done this, how we'd made it work. His approach not only challenged conventional wisdom, but also sparked curiosity among his peers about this people-centric business strategy. Despite all its problems, the United States remains a significant player on the global economic stage. Its modern financial system has shaped the world economy as we know it today. And if Americans can construct a healthier market system, it has the potential to guide the entire global economy towards a more sustainable trajectory. As Rana Foroohar argues in her book Makers and Takers, the bigger challenge is to teach America's future business leaders how to be curious, humane, and moral, how to think outside the box about problems like funding the research for a new blockbuster drug, and how to be strong enough to stand up to Wall Street when it demands the opposite. If you want to find out how you can escape the rat race, then make sure you watch this video.